Good evening, everybody. I'm Gillian Triggs, the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, and I'm really delighted to see so many of you here on this rather blustery evening in a very old and much-loved theatre at the University of Sydney. As I say, it's wonderful to see so many of you, and that, of course, is a reflection of our very distinguished speaker tonight. But I would firstly like to talk a little bit about RightsTalk. We've been running this program through last year. It's been something of a success in the sense that we've been able to engage more of the public and the general community in a debate about how to balance fundamental rights, responsibilities, freedoms in a modern Australian democracy. We're very fortunate to have the Honourable Michael Kirby with us today as our first speaker this year, and he's going to speak about his work as leader of the United Nations Commission of Inquiry on Alleged Human Rights Violations in the Democratic Republic of Korea. But before I introduce Michael, I'd like to say how wonderful it is for me to be back on campus at the University of Sydney as a former Law Dean, and to thank the University for letting us use this theatre. Can I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this very distinguished university sits, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I greatly respect their elders past and present. Well, how does one introduce Michael? I thought I'd begin this time by looking at Michael's website, which is unlike any other website I've ever visited. You log on, and this is what Michael says to you. Welcome to my homepage. This allows me to speak directly to you. Until now, I've mainly had to speak through the forbidding pages of court reports and formal legal texts. Of course, this hasn't stopped me in the past from speaking directly. But basically, I want to write to you in the same way that I speak. My career has included work as a judge in the two great Australian appellate courts, the High Court of Australia and the Court of Appeal in New South Wales. Everyone who visits this space has a right to agree or disagree with what they find. Causing occasional offence is not the greatest sin. Being boring, self-righteous or unkind compete for that award. I welcome feedback and suggestions as I embrace new adventures in my life that include work completely outside the great game of the law. Well, when you read that, you know you're dealing with a very different man, and a man who's had an extraordinary career in Australia and a great contribution to Australia. He's one of Australia's longest serving and best loved and most recognised judges, both internationally and nationally. As a member of the High Court of Australia, he was acting Chief Justice on 2 occasions, and I believe made one of the greatest contributions ever to our understanding of public international law and his role in Australian law, especially so in relation to human rights. In addition to his outstanding career as a jurist, Michael's demonstrated that there is life after achieving the highest office in the land. He's developed multiple careers as an author in academia, international and national arbitration law, as a member of the United Nations Global Commission on HIV/AIDS, a member of the Eminent Persons Group considering the future of the Commonwealth of Nations, and of course as a media celebrity reaching the pinnacle of his career perhaps in opening Yoko Ono's exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art at the Rocks a little while ago. And you can see a picture on Michael's website. The latest of his appointments, and the reason that we're here tonight, is that Michael was appointed by the President of the United Nations Human Rights Council to the Commission of Inquiry on Alleged Human Rights Violation in the Democratic Republic of Korea. Michael will not report until a little while from now, but he is able to discuss his work, his methodology, and some of the evidence. So please join me in welcoming Michael.
Thank you very much, Professor Triggs, and thank you for having this talk in the Wallace Theatre. I thought that I was in for a quiet, intimate discussion with a few members of the Australian Human Rights Commission in a quiet office and a gin tonic at the end of the day. And instead, here I am back in where it all began for me, in the University of Sydney. I came up from Fort Street High School, and I remember so distinctly being on the steps of this theatre just outside with the young Murray Gleeson and the young Brian Tamberlin and young Graham Hill, all of whom went on to become distinguished judges in our country. If an angel had alighted on our shoulders and told us what was going to happen to us, we probably wouldn't have believed it. But it does make you very conscious of the precious gift of education and of our obligation as citizens of this country to make sure, as was the case with me and my family, that there are proper means whereby everybody can attain success, personal as well as professional. I remember being in this room when Thelma Herring, a wonderful lecturer in the English department, took us through 7 centuries of English sonnets. And she had a wonderful gift of saying a sonnet. And she would look up into the corner and say the sonnets through the 7 centuries and then teach us the contrast and the different styles, all squeezed into that rather formal Italianate form of poetry. And how wonderful it was to have your eyes open to poetry and to new thoughts, and it all happened here. This was the main theatre in which I received my first and second year education before I went down to the old law school in Phillip Street. So thank you very much for bringing me back to this place. And it was in this place that I met and learned to respect a number of Aboriginal Australians, including Charlie Perkins, as we called him, who was a great leader of the Aboriginal cause and who ultimately took part in the freedom rides. And though I was a little old to be a member of the freedom ride parties, I was at a suitable age to become their honorary lawyer. I was the honorary solicitor for the SRC after having been the president of the SRC at this university. And we defended people in the country towns of New South Wales. Hard for us to remember this now, but country towns like Moree that didn't permit Aboriginals to swim in the baths, in the natural waters in Moree. And my role was as the solicitor for a group of Aboriginal Australians led by students from this university who went up to Walgett. Walgett, a country town in the far west, didn't allow Aboriginals to go upstairs in the cinema. They could go downstairs where there was vinyl, but upstairs in the plush seats, they were not allowed. And a group of university students of those days, early 1960s I'm talking about, took a group of Aboriginal young people in Walgett by the hand and led them upstairs in the Walgett cinema. And they were then charged with trespass, and we, the lawyers, had to try to defend them. I thought to myself, who will I get to be their barrister? And so I naturally went straight to the top. I got Gordon Sanders, who later became QC, a great advocate, and later my colleague in the Court of Appeal of New South Wales, and subsequently the Governor of New South Wales, and we got all of the students off without a criminal penalty. But it taught me the importance of courage in human rights, and the importance of standing up, and the importance of leadership. And they were in advance of my thinking, actually, at the time, but they taught me. So I hope the university students of today are still like those who liberated the swimming pool at Moree and the cinema at Walgett. Thank you all for being here tonight. My talk is going to be on the work of the Commission of Inquiry on North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK. Everyone calls it DPRK. That is the formal name of North Korea. And its history and its traditions and its ideology are very distinctive. And all of those things are an explanation of where it finds itself today. The Commission of Inquiry was established by a resolution of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. The Human Rights Council is the peak body of human rights protection in our world. It works in Geneva. It has a huge room which is under a kind of dome. This dome is something that has been added to the rather Mussolinian kind of building, which is the Palais des Nations in Geneva. And in that domed room within the Palais des Nations is the round room with the desks seated round, where the issues of human rights in our world come together for deliberation by the representatives of the nation states. The predecessor of the Human Rights Council was, of course, the Human Rights Commission. And my first encounter with the Human Rights Commission arose when, in the 1990s, I was appointed by Secretary General Boutros Ghali to be his special representative for human rights in Cambodia. And my job was to go to speak to the Human Rights Commission, to give reports, to answer questions, and to sit there whilst other special rapporteurs and special representatives of the Secretary General gave their reports. And I remember at that time being so impressed that in this one room came together representatives from all over the world, and those who were oppressors of human rights were expected to and did turn up. And they had to sit there whilst the special rapporteurs reported to the world on the wrongs that they had found by their inquiries, and the autocrats and oppressors who didn't have to answer to anyone back home had to give their response. And so I thought, as I sat there as a lawyer in the 1990s, here is a kind of development rather similar to the development we saw in our legal tradition, traced as it is back through England. At Runnymede, this was a place where cruel autocracy suddenly met modern notions of accountability. And although it is imperfect, and although it has very definite defects and frustrations for those who have to work within it and with it, it is definitely an advance on what was there before. And so I bring tonight the good news that our world is now no longer a place of completely unanswerable oppression. Our world is now a place where the nation states can come together and decide that they will investigate a matter and bring alleged violations of fundamental human rights to account, and bring it to account before the bar of humanity. And this is what the Human Rights Council, successor to the Commission, decided to do in March of 2013. And it did it in a most unusual way. Normally, when a decision is made to establish a special rapporteur or a special commission of inquiry, there is dissent. But interestingly, when the Human Rights Council of the world decided in March 2013 to create a commission of inquiry, quite a formal body, a notch up from a special rapporteur and even from a special representative of the Secretary General, an indication of the seriousness with which the international community regarded the matter. When this proposal was put to the Human Rights Council in March 2013, it passed without a vote. That is to say, no one called for a vote. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea did not call for a vote. And the reason for that may be that if you trace the votes in the Human Rights Council and in other organs of the United Nations concerning complaints about North Korea in the area of human rights, over time the numbers of nation states that could be seen always to stand with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was beginning to ebb away, such that DPRK was increasingly being seen to stand on its own. And when it came to the proposal of the President of the Human Rights Council, Mr. Herzl, a Polish diplomat, to put the matter to the Council that a commission of inquiry should be created as proposed by a number of the nation states, members of the Council, he paused. I think it's probably still online. It's a most unusual and rather dramatic moment in our world. This is our world in its representatives, when he was waiting to hear if there would be votes against or a call for a vote. But call for a vote came there not. And so the Commission of Inquiry was established. I was then at a castle in England, as one does. I mean, if you are retired and a pensioner, then the only place for you to go is a castle. This was Hurstmonceux Castle, built by the Norman conquerors of England in the south of England, not far from the sea, and I was there for a conference with statisticians. Statisticians are so much more interesting than lawyers. They are truly very brilliant people. And so I was there with the former statistician Royal and various other statisticians from Canada, the United States and Australia, and a few strays who wandered in, including myself. And I got this message asking me to contact the Minister for Foreign Affairs. And so I thought, what can this possibly mean? And so I dragged myself away from the statisticians, contacted the Minister's office. The Minister, being a politician, was too busy to take the call, but ultimately I got the message that somebody has put your name forward to be appointed as a member of the Commission of Inquiry on North Korea, and would you be prepared to accept it if elected or appointed? And so I had to, of course, speak at once to my partner, and he said, "Oh no, don't do that. We've got a big holiday coming." Have you forgotten the big holiday? You've been promising me this holiday for 34 years. And the car is booked, the tickets are purchased, and it's got to go ahead. And I said, yes, very well, And I rang them and said, yes, I'll take this position. And so I did, and then I was duly informed in due course that I was appointed, and that I was appointed as the chair. And so my partner Jan and I took part of our holiday, not very much alas, but in that part, and this is relevant, we went into Germany and into the Czech Republic as it is now. And in the Czech Republic, we went to a place called Terezin. Terezin is a small town which once was a garrison town of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it's in what used to be Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, not very far from the German border. And when it had earlier been part of the lands occupied by East settled Germans, it had been called Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt was named after the Empress Teresa of Austria and Hungary, and Theresienstadt was a town with a very large fort, and the fort was surrounded by a moat. It was a very big fort, but very secure because it was surrounded by this deep moat. And Theresienstadt had a famous history back in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, whose end began with the murder of Franz Joseph 100 years ago this year. And Theresienstadt entered into a second period of its history as one of the centres of the concentration camps established by the Third Reich for the reception of Jews and others who didn't fit into their notions of a good society. This is the ticket to Terezin, as the Czechs call it, Theresienstadt, as the Germans called it. This is the ticket that got me in to the museum at Theresienstadt. And my partner Jan told me a little story. It was a story based upon something he had been taught as a boy of 6 or 7, receiving his primary education in the Netherlands, just after the end of the war, therefore just after the end of the occupation by the German forces. Though he is exactly the same age as I, he looks much younger, but then again he's had a very pampered life. A life pampered by the 45 years we will have been together next week. 45 years we've been together. I'm telling you a story. I asked for him to come along tonight, but he said, I've heard all your speeches before. But he told me this little story that he'd been taught as a little boy in the period immediately following the Second World War. He'd been told that a delegation had come to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. In fact, it had come twice, once in 1941 and the second time in 1944. The second visit was not only permitted by the German authorities, but actually encouraged by the German authorities. And Himmler, who was already beginning to contemplate the end of the war and the possibility that he might need to save his own skin and reach out, as a suggested saviour of the world and of the Western Allies with Germany, that he might become the great negotiator of the peace. A more hopeless suggestion that the head of the SS should become the negotiator of peace. But dreams exist in the minds of human beings, and that dream existed in the minds of Himmler. So Himmler encouraged a delegation to go to Theresienstadt, then heavily occupied by a very large Jewish cohort, but also of the others that the Nazis sent to their concentration camps. Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, socialists, the gypsies, Roma, gays, and others who were distasteful to the simplicities of thought of the Nazi era. And when the group was constituted, they went to the International Committee of the Red Cross. The International Committee of the Red Cross, of course, did and still does wonderful work for the protection of individuals, and particularly in times of conflict. And they were forever asking to go to the concentration camps to inspect the alleged abuses of human rights. But as Johan remembered his schoolboy instruction from Mr. Clausen's, his history teacher, he was taught that this group was rather special because it was headed by the Attorney General of occupied Denmark. It contained another member who was from the International Committee of the Red Cross, and it contained a third member who was a Swiss national but of German origin, said to be rather sympathetic to the Nazis. And so, as Johan remembered it, the delegation went to Theresienstadt, and when they got there, they were required to conform to certain rules. This was the condition on which they had access to the camp. Number one, they were not to speak to any of those whose human rights were at stake. They had to walk along a red line and not speak, though they could see. Number two, they had to attend a play which would be put on for them, a humorous play within the camp, mostly of Jewish players, with some music. Number three, they were to attend a soccer match with great rejoicing and happiness as the young people ran around the field. And the International Committee of the Red Cross, according to Johan's recollection, agreed to conform to these requirements. And so the delegation came, and they came with a very real expectation. They were Dane, the head was a Dane. He was asked actually to play the role of the head of the camp, something which he agreed to do. And they submitted to these rules, and he played that role for a very particular reason. He wanted, by showing these efforts, to get a crumb from the German occupiers of the camp at Theresienstadt. The crumb was he would be allowed to take from the camp the 6 Danish Jews who were in the camp. Theresienstadt, you see, was a rather unusual. It was a camp to which was sent the Jews from Northern Europe. So there were many, many Jews from the Netherlands there. And there were Jews from Denmark there. Secondly, it had any Jews and others, communists and so on, who in the First World War had won the Iron Cross first class. Adolf Hitler, you remember, won the Iron Cross first class in the First World War. and he always respected those who had won the Iron Cross First Class. And so they would go to Theresienstadt, and the story circled round that they would get preferential treatment, not for them to be sent off to the extermination camps. They were going to be given a transit to a much more acceptable conclusion of their ordeal. So, when we got to Theresienstadt, we went to the museum, and I commended to you, we should not forget these things. We should continue to remind ourselves. Young people must be told about this. We must not think this can't happen in our country. We must never think that our country is exempt from such things. Germany, if I dare say so, was a much more civilised country than Australia, and yet it happened in Germany. And therefore, it's got lessons for everyone, everywhere. So we went into Theresienstadt, we went to the museum, and lo and behold, on the wall, in French, was the story of this delegation. I found it hard to believe, but everything that my partner had remembered from his boyhood recollections was right. They had to walk the red line, they could not talk to those who were there, they could write what they saw and heard, but they had to go to the play, enjoy the concert, be seen smiling and laughing, watching the exuberance of the soccer match, and then depart with the 6 Danish Jews. Just imagine being in that camp when this tiny group of 6, with their meagre belongings, packed their little suitcases, got on a bus with the delegation, and the bus then moved slowly out of Theresienstadt. That moment was etched in my imagination. And Johan said to me that night, in taking on this role that you've taken on to investigate DPRK, North Korea, there must be no red lines. You must not observe any rules or any requirements that impede a completely true and honest record of what you see and what you find. And so that, for me, has been the mandate of the work which we have undertaken in the Commission of Inquiry. My 2 colleagues are very distinguished champions of human rights. One of them, Marzuki Darusman, was the Attorney General of Indonesia, and he is at present the Special Rapporteur on human rights violations in North Korea. So he has that additional role, and it was his inability to get into North Korea that got him to recommend the establishment by the Human Rights Council of the Commission of Inquiry. The other commissioner is Sonia Basurko. She is a very distinguished human rights observer, academic, scholar, who observed the terrible infractions of human rights in the former Yugoslavia, has reported on them, written about them, took part in the proceedings which led to the trial of former leader Milosevic. She's written very widely on the issues of human rights that existed in the former Yugoslavia and in her own land, Serbia. So we 3, coming from different linguistic, cultural and legal backgrounds, make up the Commission of Inquiry. And each one of us has a commitment. There will be no red lines. There will be no appearances of satisfaction when there is no satisfaction. There will be truth to be told. That is the duty and responsibility and privilege of the members of the Commission of Inquiry. I should add as a footnote that before the film which recorded the visit of the International Committee of the Red Cross to Theresienstadt before that film was ever exposed and shown in cinemas, as it was throughout Germany and in the Allied countries. Virtually every one of those youths who took part in the soccer match and those who took part in the play had been sent to Auschwitz, and very few survived. So our commitment is to make sure that we tell things as we find them, and that will be the hallmark of the report. The report will be delivered to the President and the Human Rights Council on the 17th or 18th of March. We can't be absolutely sure because the report of the Commission of Inquiry on Syria is on the agenda to be received just before ours, and it might dribble over from the 17th to the 18th. But on one of those days, the report will be received, and when that happens, then I will be completely free to talk about the matters in the report. However, because the report hasn't yet been provided to the Human Rights Council, I hope you'll understand that I cannot do that at this stage. I cannot tell you the findings, I cannot tell you the recommendations and the conclusions and the action in follow-up that we have suggested. But that doesn't mean that this is a wasted opportunity, because the challenge of the methodology of the Commission may sound a bit tedious, but actually it's quite interesting. How do you deal with a problem of a country that refuses to allow the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations of the whole world to come into their country, that denies that there are any political prisons, that denies the abuses of human rights, and that asserts that human rights in their country is in a perfect state? How do you deal with such a country which until now has been relatively quite brilliant in sailing under the radar of the world's scrutiny? That was the challenge that we faced when we set out on our inquiry. The mandate of the Commission of Inquiry was extremely broad. It included the obligation to report on the following 10 issues. To make sure that I don't leave any of them out, I'll just read them to you. You will understand how broad it is. Food, the famine, the 1995 famine in North Korea, a terrible imposition. They call it the Great March, the arduous march. When I heard this, I wondered, what is this arduous march? It was being translated from the Korean as the people came along to tell about it, and I wondered, did they, dealing with the famine, have a big march somewhere looking for food? But that was not the case. This is old-fashioned communist language. The arduous march is the arduous march of the people in confronting the famine. Unfortunately, many people, about a third of the population of North Korea, were far too weak to have a physical march. And to this day, very large numbers of babies and young children are stunted. It's dropped slightly in recent years, according to the figures from the World Food Programme. That's one of the relatively few United Nations bodies which is allowed into North Korea, it being the price of the foreign food aid which goes to North Korea, which is essential to a degree of stability in the population and to the saving of souls. But according to those figures, about 29%, 28 to 29% of babies born in North Korea are stunted. And stunting is a phenomenon which has lifelong and profound consequences, bad consequences. In the Netherlands, just before the end of the Second World War, the parts of the Netherlands, the provinces that were liberated south of the rivers, closer to Belgium, as the Canadians and the Americans came into the Netherlands, those countries did not go through the hongerwinter. But the countries below the rivers suffered the hongerwinter, the hunger winter. It was a very great burden on the people of the Netherlands. My partner was in Nijmegen with his family. They had been moved from The Hague when the fear that the occupiers had was of a landing in Europe close to The Hague. The Germans, of course, didn't know where the Allies would come. And so the occupiers moved families from The Hague inland. And so by that stroke of chance, he and his brother and sister were moved to Nijmegen and into a home which was probably occupied by a Jewish family who had been removed. And so they went into that home, and that meant they didn't go through the hongerwinter, but many, many did. And the research in the Netherlands has shown the huge increase in the numbers of cases of Alzheimer's disease and dementia that are suffered by children who do not get proper nutrition in the womb and at birth and immediately after. So it is a very bad look to have a third of your population suffering, even to this day, from serious hunger. Prison camps, the existence of both prison camps in the nature of the types of prison that exist in any society for conviction of criminal offences, but also political prison camps, which are the subject of many complaints of infractions of human rights. Torture and inhumane treatment. When I arrived for my first visit to Seoul, we were taken to a museum in the central business district of Seoul, which during the Japanese colonial occupation had been where they sent people from Korea who were defying the occupiers. And looking at all of the forms of punishment which are illustrated by the equipment there was a useful introduction, because thereafter, in the descriptions that were given of the types of punishment that were visited on people in prison camps in North Korea, every one of the prison techniques that had been introduced by the Japanese occupiers, the pigeon torture, the aircraft torture, and the whole range of the repertoire was present in the museum and present in what was alleged to be going on in North Korea. Arbitrary arrest and detention. Discrimination. There is, to an outsider, a very strange system of social classification in North Korea. It's called the Songbin system. It basically divides the population into three classes. Not for Kim Il-sung is the Marxist classification of the plutocrats, the middle class, and the heroic working class. There is a classification which I think has 95 sub-classifications, but fundamentally there are three. There are the special class, that is to say those who are taken as favourable to the regime in North Korea. There is the wavering class, that is to say those who are not hostile or third class, but who aren't entirely reliable. And then there's the hostile class. And the hostile class number a very high proportion of the population. And this classification is a kind of caste system which has been imposed by the doctrinal teachings of Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea after the Second World War. As well as discrimination on the grounds of caste, there are many stories of discrimination on the grounds of gender. And we were fortunate in our work in the Commission of Inquiry to have assigned to us from United Nations Women, the new agency of the United Nations that looks after issues of human rights affecting women, particularly, and issues of development affecting women, UN Women. We had assigned to us a young researcher whose job it was to make sure that the Commission didn't fall into the error of overlooking women's issues, and in particular discrimination against women. This is a new procedure that is being adopted in the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights and in the UN Women. And the young lawyer who was assigned to us was in fact an Australian lawyer, Siobhan Hobbs, who'd been the associate to a judge in Australia, now the Chief Justice of the ACT, and who therefore could understand the way of thinking that I at least had, and who could disagree sometimes with the way of thinking that I displayed, and made every attempt to make sure that I didn't fall into any too noticeable, egregious errors of insufficient sensitivity. We only really ever had one big battle. It was a battle about nomenclature. She wanted to call fishermen fishers. Now, you could look fisher up in the dictionary. The one dictionary that uses it as a noun says that a fisher is a furry animal known in Canada. But she said fisher is a perfectly good gender-neutral expression. I said it may well be, but it is not a word that has come into the English language yet. She said, now is the time. Well, as the first judge in Australia who dropped the Mister back there in the dark days of the 1980s and became Justice instead of Mr. Justice, I was still very doubtful, but we reached a compromise. And the compromise was that the first time the word fisherman appeared, we put fisherman in brackets, inverted commas, fisher. Those brackets, those inverted commas. And that therefore became a defined term. So I was prepared to go along with it. But anyway, we had much more substantial matters of gender. But I just wanted to tell you that little story to show how democratic I was and how talk of the great dissenter was highly exaggerated. To be the great dissenter depends on who you're working with and who you're dissenting from. And I'm happy to say that on the report of the Commission of Inquiry we had no dissents, and not even in the case of the language of Fisher. Number 6 was freedom of expression. Number 7 was the right to life. Number 8 was violation on freedom of movement. To move anywhere in North Korea out of your immediate district, you need to have official permission, which is extremely difficult to obtain, particularly if you're a member of the hostile class. And therefore that puts controls on people, and their whereabouts can be very closely monitored. Number 8 was violation of freedom of movement. Number 9 was enforced disappearances and abductions. This was the area which would most closely concern Japan, because in Japan, a number of nationals of Japan have been abducted. And there's no real doubt that this happened by reason of the action of agents of the state of North Korea. We know this because when Prime Minister Koizumi went to Pyongyang for the first encounter since the Second World War of a Prime Minister of Japan and a Supreme Leader of North Korea, and he saw Kim Jong-il in a moment of candor admitted that this had been the policy of DPRK to abduct Japanese. The exact number that he admitted to is a matter of contest, and the Japanese government considers that the number is much more substantial than those admitted by DPRK. They contend that it is at least 19 Japanese nationals, but some accounts put it much more like 100 or 200, and it is a source of the greatest pain. One of the cases involved, we met the families of the abductees, or the people who claim to be abductees. One of the cases involved a young girl, Megumi. Megumi had been to school. She was 13, and she had stayed back for basketball practice. She was expected at home for dinner. Her parents were waiting for her, Mr. and Mrs. Yokota. Mr. and Mrs. Yokota were very distinguished middle-class human beings who were expecting their daughter home. She never came, and they are still waiting. They came to give evidence in our inquiry in Tokyo, and I asked them if you could speak directly to the Supreme Leader of North Korea, what would you say? And Mrs. Yokota said in a most polite way, I would say to him, you have a family, you have a very famous family, you know what family life is like. We have our family, we miss Megumi, and all we want to know is she still alive? Is she healthy? Is she happy? That's all they wanted. And that is in her testimony before the Commission of Inquiry. The 10th heading for our inquiry was in some ways the most important. It concerned accountability. How do we render accountable any who are found to have been in breach of the fundamental principles of universal human rights? How do we, in the face of the inability to get in, the inability to make contact with the regime there, render those who are guilty accountable? And that raises the question of whether there has been established crimes against humanity, and if so, what follows. And so they were the 10 headings. It's really 9 headings and an action heading, number 10. And the inquiry required us, in effect, to present 10 reports. Any one of those subjects would be a substantial report in itself. But the requirement that we saw to be imposed upon us in the period we had available was to, as it were, digest the material and present a photograph of the situation as it stands today. In the grim days after the Second World War, so many people said, particularly but not only people in Germany, we had no idea, we did not know, we were not aware, if only we had known. Well, in the case of North Korea, after the 17th or 18th of March 2014, there will be no excuse for that statement on the part of the international community or anybody else. The material, the digested, compressed, summarised, accepted evidence will be presented, and it will then be for those who have the responsibility for action to decide what should happen. Now, the most obvious problem we faced when we started was, how can you tell the stories of food, prison camps, discrimination, violations of freedom of movement, etc., if you can't get in there and talk to people? The normal way an inquiry would take place in our country is the inquirers would immediately go to places. And if there is a contention that there is no prison camp, then you just go to the place where it's alleged to be, and you take out the camera and you go around, you tromp around the place. I've done this many times. When I was a barrister, you have what's called a view or an inspection. You just go around and that's how you can establish, help to establish by evidence and by inspection what you can see. But North Korea would not let us in. And that required us to be a little bit different to most commissions of inquiry. Most commissions of inquiry of the United Nations, in fact all but one in the past, has acted in the way of the civil law. The civil law is the Napoleonic system of France. It's an inquisitorial system. It's very efficient. It goes, it gets evidence, it speaks to people, often behind closed doors. It gathers the testimony. It doesn't take a lot of time, and it's a way of doing things rather rapidly. But my whole experience as a judge and as a lawyer in Australia has been the common law system. The common law system is much more slow, a bit more cumbersome, certainly more expensive, more time-consuming, but it puts a very great store on manifest conduct, on transparency, of being visible. Every day of my 34 years as an appellate judge, I sat in court, and people could wander in, sometimes in huge numbers in the High Court in Canberra, sometimes a tiny trickle. Maybe you'd look up and suddenly there'd be a room full of school children. But you can come in. Our courts are almost, without exception, open. And though we were not a court, as the Commission of Inquiry, we were not a prosecutor, we were a tribunal. We were trying to find matters, and we thought it would be much better if we do it in the way of the common law, open. Because part of the problem has been the testimony has not really got out. There are particular books or there are stories and no one quite knows what to say. Well now, if you have any doubt about the matters that will be disclosed in the report of the Commission of Inquiry on North Korea, all you've got to do is go to the website and look at the testimony that was taken in Seoul, in Tokyo, in London, in Washington, and judge for yourself. It's now online. The whole world can see it. Thousands of people are logging in and having a look at it. And this, we thought, was a way to make sure that the testimony was out there and confronting, in a sense, not only us, the decision makers who would have to make recommendations, but the whole world and the leaders and the politicians of the world. And as well as that, there was another way that we could jump the barrier, and that was by way of the satellites. To me, I'm sure younger people would know about that because they are forever looking at their computer and forever Googling and going into the local far away and exotic places. But satellites, including the Google Earth, but also the very much more specific and particular satellites that are available to some governments and that have come into the hands of some human rights bodies and are therefore available to the Commission of Inquiry. They can get down to a pinpoint accuracy which literally can see from space, from the satellite, particular human beings are wandering around. It's very, very pricey. In some ways it's rather frightening for privacy reasons, but it's there. No more nude sunbathing on the terrazzo. It can all be secure. But also the prison camps and the places. You see, the prisoners could say when they went there or when they were released, or in one case only when he escaped through the wire, they could give the local township and the local district, and they could explain where it was with pinpoint accuracy, and so it's not difficult just to go in there and have a look for yourself. So it's much harder in today's world to establish a Teresian start, because the Teresian start can now be seen from outer space and can be seen by all of us. And so these were the two ways that we set about gathering our testimony. Some people said, well, the testimony will often be out of date, and it's true that some people had fled and escaped 10 years ago, or 12 or 15, but many had only left North Korea 2 years ago, or even earlier, even later. They had very fresh memories and recollections, and many of them could describe the famine and the arduous march. And so we have a great mass of testimony, and it's possible to compare one person's evidence with another to see if they appear to corroborate each other on particular details. And there's a great deal of corroboration in the testimony that's given. I think this was a very good technique of gathering the evidence. You can also see the facial appearance and the way in which the witness answers the question, and whether they appear to be, as one would not be surprised occasionally to see, people with a mission, angry people. But most of them appeared just to be telling their story, and they regarded their story as relatively pedestrian, and yet it was very important for the story which we built up. A feature of our report is that it is studied and illustrated throughout with statements from the testimony of the witnesses, with references to where you can find that in the website, and no doubt ways of crossing to that in the electronic version. And so these were the means by which we gathered the evidence. We had to take more witnesses confidentially because a large number of witnesses were not willing to give open testimony. They feared for their family, they still had family there. Some witnesses wanted to disguise themselves, didn't want their faces seen. One young girl who had taken part in the mass games in Pyongyang, who wanted to give evidence of how oppressive it was, month after month, to be exercising at the cost of your lessons in these choreography organised marches and dances. She wanted to disguise herself because she came from a privileged class and she still had family there. So steps were taken to disguise, but most of them, even some with family there, said, no, I want to stand up. I want to bear witness. I want to bear witness. Mary Robinson, when she delivered office as High Commissioner for Human Rights, said, I had no army, I had very few resources, but I could bear witness. And that's what the witnesses who came before us sought to do, and that's what the Commission of Inquiry has the obligation to do. We called for submissions. We got many submissions. and there was no problem getting evidence. There was plenty of evidence. Some, interestingly, explained that they missed North Korea. If you grow up in a country, you will miss it. Some of them expressed admiration for Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, who must, by any account, have been a charismatic person. Others of them, of course, had very strong feelings against. But we also were required by our mandate to work closely with the United Nations agencies, which we did, particularly with the World Food Programme, the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees. We worked very closely with them. We didn't seek to interact with the International Committee of the Red Cross, because they don't interact with these human rights investigations, concentrating as they do on helping people in these desperate situations. To every witness who came, we made great pains to assess their testimony for its truthfulness, and if it passed that test, to assess them for any risks that they ran in coming to us. We were obliged by our mandate not to do harm to people in gathering our evidence, and to judge whether they should give it confidentially or publicly. But there's plenty online, hour after hour of it. And I do commend to you to just have a look. The Tokyo hearings, for example, are very interesting with the victims of abduction. And in Washington, they're interesting because there were a lot of experts in Washington on North Korean issues, and they came along to give their testimony. We've also taken a lot of care in respect of our records to protect them, to protect the people who trusted us, and to make sure that all the archives are secure and placed in proper condition. When I was Special Representative in Cambodia, I learned how important the archiving of the suffering of the people of Cambodia was. Even if there is no immediate follow-up, even if the Commission of Inquiry can't force the United Nations or the member states to follow up immediately, just the keeping of the record, the taking of the record, the provision of the record online, all of this is a contribution to doing better than humanity did in the 1930s and during the Second World War. So it's a long journey from the visit to Theresienstadt to the writing of the report. The report was written with great care. We have had a secretariat of 12 officers, though many of them had been in the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. When they worked for the Commission of Inquiry, they were completely independent. They did not take orders from the Office of the High Commissioner or the High Commissioner. They took orders from us, the Commissioners, and their independence was respected. It was also respected by member states. I, for example, said very early on that really I needed some research assistance to help get through the massive material. And the Department of Foreign Affairs, just before the end of the financial year, this is amazing how this happens, found a little pot of gold, but it was not given to me, and it was not given to the Commission of Inquiry. It was given to the University of New South Wales in order that they could provide 2 researchers to be selected by the commissioners. In that way, Australia very properly distanced itself from any influence. So these are basically young, brilliant university students who have helped in the work of the Commission. They were especially helpful because of the 12 members of the Secretariat, all of them brilliant and fiendishly devoted to their duties, only 2 were Anglophones. And therefore, you get a report that is written, which is accurate, and you understand it, but it is literal translation of how it would be said in German, or in Farsi in one case, or in French. And it has to be put into English that is comfortable. And that was a very important role that I had to play, because I was the only Anglophone native speaker as a commissioner, and my 2 researchers went through everything. They found thousands of things where it could be expressed just a little bit better to make it readable. I hope that in due course the report will not only be online, as it will be, but will be published. I think it's a very interesting read, and it's a story that must be told. It mustn't just gather dust in the basement of a Palais Wilson in Geneva. It has to be out there in the world, and it has to contribute to an improvement of human rights, hopefully through the acceptance of North Korea, but if not, by action that is taken by the international community as appropriate to the recommendations. So that's basically what I came to tell you. You want to know what we're going to say, but I'm not going to tell you, because that can't be revealed out of courtesy and respect for the Commission for the Human Rights Council. But save for that restriction, I'll be very happy to answer questions. But first, and for the first time in this lecture hall, I ask for a very big round of applause. Questions or comments? This is a free society, and you can disagree or make suggestions or comments. That will be appreciated. Yes, now there is a roving microphone somewhere here. Here we go.
Where was that?
I don't think it's working.
Hello? Hello? Yep, we can hear.
Yeah, all right, we'll speak into the microphone directly and loud. Good. First question.
Hi, should we introduce ourselves? Or?
I can't hear you.
Should we introduce ourselves?
No.
Well, if you wish to, you can, but I don't think that's necessary if you don't want to.
Your report, how do you sense and feel that if it will, apply pressure in time to the regime of North Korea?
Well, that remains to be seen, and it remains for the international community to respond. Just as in our own country, when a commission of inquiry conducts an investigation, the commission doesn't have the power to enforce its decisions and gives its recommendations to the political branch. That's our role. In a sense, we are subordinate. We are making a conclusion, reaching a conclusion, making findings, and expressing recommendations. And that's what we do. And in a sense, if we do that well, then we have done our job. And that job is itself useful for the reason that I've explained. It's bearing witness. But that would not be enough, in my opinion, for the work of the Commission. And therefore, it will be a matter of trying to follow up the work of the Commission ourselves. Already we are planning a large number of encounters to explain the Commission's report. And we will be at the Commission, at the Human Rights Council. We will be giving it to the international community. There are various other steps which are under investigation, which I don't want to go into now. But you can take it that everything that can properly be done by the Commission of Inquiry will be done. And in the end, do I have blue helmets that I can send into North Korea? Obviously not. Do I have the capacity to invoke the Security Council for a binding resolution of the international community? Obviously I don't. All of these are steps down the track, and they will depend upon the power, persuasiveness of the report and the evidence which is revealed. That will just have to wait until the report's in the public domain. Any other questions or comments? Yes. Now we have to be quick here. There's somebody here. No, it has to be into a microphone and loud.
Do you imagine...
This microphone is hopeless. Yes. Is there a technician here that can fix the microphone?
I can try.
I'll try to use my big voice.
Yes, use a loud voice.
Do you imagine North Korea having a negative reaction to your report? And perhaps what it might be?
Well, of course, that is a possibility. We've been very courteous to North Korea. Even my microphone doesn't seem to be working. Is my microphone working? I don't know why you can't have proper microphones
In the auditorium. We have.
Sorry.
The microphone should have been fixed. Next time you have a speaker, this is also rather weak. Hopeless. We have been very courteous to them. What we did initially, we invited them to engage with us. We invited them to send representatives to the public hearings. We invited them to comment on the draft report when it was prepared. We gave them opportunities to come along and call witnesses of their own, all of which they have refused to do. There is a principle which is observed both by the civil law tradition and by the common law tradition, that if, having had the opportunity to participate, a party declines to take that opportunity, then that is, you can more readily accept the testimony because the party that had the opportunity to cross-examine or recall evidence has not taken that opportunity. And so that is the position as far as North Korea is concerned. Will they have an adverse consequence? Well, that will depend. Those who watch North Korea say that it varies between charm offensive, which is what is said to be on at the moment, with the outreach to permit family reunions, which were cancelled. Having had the ballot for the families that won the right to meet their family member from the north, it was suddenly and arbitrarily cancelled, allegedly because of military exercises, which were regular features of that time of the year anyway. So how they will react, I don't know. But frankly, that is not my responsibility. My responsibility is to walk no red line, refrain from talking to nobody, and not to report what we see. We will report it as it is. And then the way they react may well help to demonstrate the need for a proper response to the report commission. Any questions over on this side? Very well, I'll come up here. Microphone. Can you believe that the microphone doesn't I think the Commission should ask for its money back.
I'm just wondering if you share with us some testimony from an escapee that you talked away. You did tell us about the Japanese family, and I was just wondering, was there anything from an escapee that was equally reckless?
Yes, well, of course, we had the testimony of Mr. Shin, Mr. Shin is the one who, with the co-author, wrote Escape from Camp Quebec, which is the story of how one person only has escaped from a prison camp. Only one person is on record for having escaped. He was actually born in the prison camp because his mother and father were there for some political crime that they were alleged to have committed. So he was born there and he grew up there to the age of about 20. And that's when he decided with the last minute he made a momentary decision to escape. And the man with whom he escaped went through a break in the wall, but it was a break that was fortified by the electric current. And he had to walk over the body of the man who died. He was electrocuted. And he walked over the body of the man who escaped. And the interesting thing is, he said what he was thinking of all the time was food. He was thinking of having a full meal. He wasn't thinking of liberty. He wasn't thinking of universal human rights and universal declaration of 1948. He was thinking of a plate of food. And that kept him going until he ultimately got into China. There were many, many terrible stories, apparently true, by witnesses. One of the many cases of women. Women are the most frequent escapees to China. Women go in search of food for their families. They go into China, and previously that was more feasible because in the winter the rivers freeze over, and there were certain places where you could get across, and by a little strategic bribery you would get into China, and there meet sometimes fellow North Koreans, sometimes Chinese and others who would help, sometimes you would make contact with Christian groups and with groups that could put you in touch with the Republic of Korea, South Korea. But if you were returned to North Korea, then you had committed a criminal offence, and it was very seriously dealt with. Now, there does appear in South Korea to be in North Korea rather, to be a somewhat racist principle of the purity of the blood. The notion that North Koreans are a specially pure form of Korean nationality, and that therefore they shouldn't get pregnant with a Chinese person, because that means that they're bringing into the purity of a racial group, North Korea, a person of Chinese ethnicity. And there was testimony, and there were instances of women suffering forced abortions to get rid of this baby of mixed heritage, or in one case, a woman who was forced to witness her baby being put into a bucket and suffocated by drowning. So there were many terrible stories of public executions, and of course it is now admitted in DPRK that Yang Soon-Jek, the uncle of the present leader, Kim Jong-un, was himself caught, apprehended in the meeting of the Politburo, taken out, and within 2 days he had been tried by a military tribunal and was executed. And there are reports in news items coming in today that members of his family have also been executed. This is the way a political difference is settled in North Korea. So there are many horrifying stories and all this that we have access to the proper standard proof will these stories because there were too many, but there will be enough to illustrate the conclusions of the report, the findings of particular parts of the report. Any other questions over here? Yes.
You said that you operated on the principle of no red line, but do you think that there is an argument for making some concessions to Australia, especially when it's isolated with North Korea, in order to gain access or cooperation?
Well, I can understand that the political decision makers to whom the report will go will have a quandary that they will have to face. I also certainly believe in the value, in some instances, of truth and reconciliation commissions and ways of dealing with matters by consensus and discussion. But I'm not at all sure that that is suitable in the DPRK, but this is discussed in the report. And in any case, our job is the subordinate one. Our job is to reach conclusions on the 10 matters of our mandate. It isn't to do the politics. The politics has to be done by those who are politicians. But I think it's right that we should take the instruction no red lines. But as to what politicians do with the report, well, they're making red lines all the time. They do it in Australia, they no doubt do it in North Korea and in South Korea too. One thing we did learn very early on was you can't believe every news report you read about North Korea. You will have seen the report that Uncle Gang Soon was fed to dogs. I think it was 120 wild dogs. It was such a bizarre, it was like those emails you get, you know, from a particular banking house where you do not have any dealing with your account is about to be closed and you must give immediately this vital information. Well, this was a report that began apparently in a social network in China. And then it's picked up in South Korea. Wide-eyed people often believe it. It's then reticulated. We learned very early in the piece that you can't act on that. You have to have confirmation. You have to have material that is trustworthy, that is accepted according to the standards of what is acceptable to an ordinary person, a reasonable person. That was the standard that we have adopted in our inquiry. Any other questions? Yes.
Okay, I think my issue is, I guess, North Korea can always...
It can't be heard. It can't be heard by the audience.
Yeah,
and it can't be heard by me.
I can yell.
Yeah, well, yell.
Okay. My issue is that at some level, North Korea can use its boundaries. It can basically wall itself off from the world and think it doesn't matter what the world thinks of us. We will do our thing. Now, at some level, you have hinted that North Korea has gone on charm offensives. Maybe it does have some concern about world opinion of it. But I do have this feeling that at some level, North Korea can wall itself up and say, we do not care what the world thinks of us. We do not care what external assessments will be like. I mean, there's been obviously a few other things that you've said that they've gone on charm offensives, but okay, you're more focusing on this project, and this is more, I guess, international relations, but maybe you have something to say.
Well, you might well be right. And after all, the DPRK has access to a nuclear arsenal. And therefore, they may reach conclusions along the lines that you've suggested. But time is not on their side in the long term in relation to respect for universal human rights. One of the interesting phenomena of recent times has been the spread of the mobile phone network, the cell phone. Now, at the moment, it doesn't have access to the internet. It doesn't have access beyond North Korea. A very small cohort of the elite can have access to the worldwide web, but most have only access within North Korea. But even that is a remarkable development. It's a beneficial development. It enhances the right of access to information. It's been proving very useful in the rudimentary growth of a private sector market economy, which has been beneficial to reducing the shortages of grain, because people can contact each other and find out where grain is, what the price is, what's available. So, and the spread of knowledge and information, including sometimes the use of local mobile phones or mobile phones brought in with SIM cards from China, can make contact across the border. Time is against any country in the world, wherever they are, trying to cut themselves off from the rest of the world. And anyway, it's a very primitive way to run a country, is to try to cut yourself off at a time when the rest of humanity is making more and more contact with other societies, to say that you are providing good governance to a country and very high standards of human rights when you don't allow them to have contact with other countries. But you may be right in the short term. In the short term, they may say, well, this is the act of hostile forces, and we are on an arduous march to uphold the principles of Kim Il-sung, and we will continue to do that. But if you look around the world, and if you look at the events since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and if you look at the way history flows, I think anybody who was reflecting upon the direction of history would agree with President Obama. History bends in the direction of justice. I've always thought that the fundamental reason for human rights is a kind of genetic message which we human beings carry. A genetic message of a desire for rational explanation of things, to understand things, and also maybe something akin to the golden rule that most of us don't feel particularly comfortable if things are being done to other people that we wouldn't like to be being done to ourselves. And if you are confined to a particular district and you can't move out of it, and you have the radio or television blaring on settings to bring you messages from the leaders, well, that may convince you for a while, but once you start getting contrary messages, even on the intranet, then maybe that that source of safety will disappear. But time will tell. That's not my responsibility. My responsibility with my colleagues is to provide a report, to give the data, and then to leave it to the nation states to decide what, if anything, they will do. Yes.
You mentioned that the North Korea was given the opportunity to present its side of the story. North Korea obviously is going to counter and said, well, look, you haven't been there, right? Comes to the second group and say North Korea says, well, look, we're allowed to come in. That's a possibility. How would the Commission deal with that? It's something North Korea does about face.
Well, first of all, we made many approaches. We wrote to the mission, we wrote to the government, we wrote to the Supreme Leader, we provided data, we invited them to come to our public hearings, we gave them the opportunity, we even negotiated that they would have diplomatic immunity and other steps. We told them of that. We invited them to comment on the draft report when it was finished, which is the usual procedure of COIs, and all of which they either refused or ignored. So I don't think it's very likely that they're going to change their mind. But in any case, once we have produced our report to the Council on Human Rights, we functus officio. We have completed and discharged our mandate. It then goes back to the special rapporteur, who continues in office, and hopefully he will have opportunities to follow up and to reach out, and maybe he will be given access. The President of the United States has appointed a special representative for North Korea. That is Ambassador Robert King, and he has been given access to North Korea, though when he was last to visit, at about the time of our visit last August, his visit was cancelled at the very last minute. And so he wasn't allowed in on this occasion. Particular missionaries from or ambassadors from particular countries sometimes get in. Of course, we have there are missions in North Korea which are, in a sense, able to report as best they can within the constrictions that are imposed on them what they find in North Korea. But I don't feel as though the Commission of Inquiry has got only a partial view. I think we've got a very good picture and a very thorough picture and an up-to-date picture and an accurate picture. And all of that will inform our report, and the fact that we weren't allowed in is the decision of the government of DPRK, and having opted out of cooperation and engagement, they must take the consequences. Put that microphone down, Julie. This one mic.
Well, Michael, that's really been enthralling and very moving, and really a remarkable insight into your career, but also to have the extraordinary story of visiting the place of detention during the Second World War, and the personal connection with your own partner, and the accuracy of his memory. And I wasn't entirely sure where you were going with that story, but it became very, very clear that it has actually provided you with the key concepts of how you're going to manage this inquiry. And in
My
turn...
partner remembers everything.
But in turn, of course, as you and many of you know, we're about to embark on an inquiry into the detention, the mandatory, closed, and in many cases indefinite detention of children in Australia, more than 1,000 of them. And so I will remember every word of your presentation, and we certainly will not be walking the red line. So please join me and thank our very distinguished